Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box. It's the Saturday streaming edition. Did I say screaming? Today we're going to talk about the music video that you may or may not know from the TV or the MTV. But there was a long history, surprisingly long, in fact, of music videos before there was the MTV. And I sort of want to talk about the origins and the purposes of these music videos and whether they were distractions, whether they were augmentations, and what the general feeling among artists was for these music videos. Now, let's start from the very beginning. Sound and visual formats were invented at around the same time. Film was a bit older, but in terms of motion picture, but they were always separate. It wasn't until the 1920s that the proliferation of a marriage of film and sound became very prominent. And at first, the formats weren't even on the same media. They were synchronized between a shellac set of discs, records, in other words, and the film. That's what the first film that was a talking picture. That's how it worked. It was a process called Vitaphone, and the first talking picture was the jazz singer about a Jew who wanted to sing black style music. Could they make that in 2020? I mean, our world is so strange today. I don't know if that would be considered Oscar worthy or censor worthy. You just can't tell. But that's what people were into, at least the moviegoers in 1927. And in terms of the motion picture industry, in terms of legitimate drama on film, music was always a huge part of the early talking pictures because of logical promotion when it comes to this new technology. It's one thing to have voices speaking in these movies, but it was considered that much more sort of defining and that much more groundbreaking if you were to feature music in these newly minted talking pictures. So a lot of Broadway musicals were made into films, and a lot of the entertainers of those days, and I use that term very specifically, were meant to do it all. So let's look at people from the 1920s and 30s into the 1940s who were best known as singers. So take Al Jolson, who was the star of The Jazz Singer, the first talking picture. He wasn't just expected to sing, he was expected to act, he was expected to tell jokes, he was expected to dance. Same with Bing Crosby in the 1930s. And once you get into the 1940s, Frank Sinatra became a huge movie star and remained one, frankly, for the rest of his life, but particularly in the 50s and 60s. So in the first 20 years or so of movies with sound, musicals were a huge thing because they wanted to show off this new technology. And the recording of music obviously takes more skill and it has a bigger wow factor to the audience than straightforward dialogue with no music. It also gave birth to the idea of the musical, of the movie composer, the film composer. Because obviously silent movies, and I've said this before, they weren't exactly silent, far from it. Every silent movie that was shown would have a live musical accompaniment at a small rural theater. It might be done on, or I guess we should say cinema to be absolutely proper. You could have a man in the cinema on a small upright piano. In a larger cinema, there'd be a grand piano. In a huge downtown movie palace, there would be either an organ, a Wurlitzer or other similar makes theater organ with all the different sound effects. And you know the phrase bells and whistles? That actually comes from a reference to the theater organ, because these mighty theater organs that really reached their zenith in the 1920s, they had literal bells, whistles, percussion, brass, flutes, clarinets. They had all of these different sounds that the organist could make by playing the traditional ranks on an organ. And so that's where that phrase comes from. And so, like I was saying, in the big downtown, or even some of the bigger suburban, because there were some big suburban movie palaces of the 1920s, you would have these huge organs, and in some instances, you'd even have live orchestras. Although it became quite apparent that the huge, wonderful sound of the organ was more than sufficient, and paying one man to make the music was cheaper than paying several to be in an orchestra. Now, in terms of film composers, this was a very fledgling profession in the early 1920s because typically the artist creating the music to accompany the film would be improvising. He might have certain cues. We need, when the train goes by, we need such and such to happen. When the man, twirls his cane, we need such and such to happen. Occasionally, there were fully fledged scores written either for the organist, pianist, or orchestra, but more frequently than not, it was either semi or fully improvised by the local musician. And it was a very interesting profession, and it's something that gave a lot of local musicians a lot of work. In come the talkies in 1927, and the idea of being a theater organist or a theater pianist becomes almost overnight a non profession. What does become a thing is becoming a film composer. And as the classical music world, the modern orchestral world, whether symphony orchestras, operas, or chamber music, as this world delves deeper into the obscure, the atonal, and the avant garde, movie music was one of the areas where composers could actually write music that masses of audiences wanted to hear. I mean, take one of the great film composers of the mid 20th century, Miklos Rocha. He had always sought out to be a sort of post-romantic, neo-romantic, if you will, composer. But he found that his bread was buttered in the world of film. And he wrote some of the biggest scores for epic movies, including the legendary score to Ben-Hur. And so the marriage of sight and sound was becoming a very, very important thing in the world of the cinema. But this is not a stream about the history of cinema. This is a music show. So, what about the world of pop music? What about the world of the music video? Well, the idea of the music video actually predates the invention of videotape itself. There were devices beginning in the 1920s called panorams. And these were they looked like jukeboxes, but it had a little screen where a film that accompanied a soundtrack, a recorded soundtrack, would play. And these would feature many of the pop tunes of the day. So much like you put the little nickel in the jukebox to play a song, these panorams would be found in places like arcades, certain hotel lobbies, piers and beach towns, all the places where you'd normally go for that kind of arcade style entertainment. And so, you put the money in the machine and you watch on a little screen film projected of, let's say, Al Jolson singing a song, or later on Bing Crosby singing a song. And these were really the first music videos. Now, even though they weren't videos at all, they were film, and we'll get to that big change in a moment. Now, one of the key definitions of what a modern music video is that it is obviously visual entertainment to accompany music, typically a song that is sung. Only on the video, the artist isn't singing, he is miming, he is lip syncing. Some people do it better than others, and we'll get into that format. So, the reason I want to define that is because I want to draw the important distinction between a live concert film or video and a music video, which is a very particular thing. Now, live concert films were just as novel in the late 20s and 1930s as were traditional dramatic films like The Jazz Singer or the many Broadway musicals that were made into popular Hollywood movies. As many of you know from my other streams, one of my favorite conductors and someone who I believe is objectively one of the most important of all time, Wilhelm Mengelberg of Holland's Amsterdam's Concertgebouw Orchestra, he was one of the pioneers of the concert film, the live concert film. Only because film equipment was still quite bulky in the 1930s, the French film company that wanted to make a sound film recording of the Concertgebouw Orchestra, they weren't able to ship their equipment from Paris to Amsterdam. I mean, obviously they could physically ship it, but it was so sensitive and so cumbersome, and you needed the lighting and everything else just in place. They thought that it was easier to actually reconstruct the appearance of the concert hall, the Royal Concertgebouw Hall in Amsterdam, in a film studio on a soundstage in Paris. And so instead of bringing the cameras to Amsterdam, they took Mengelberg and his whole orchestra to Paris on a train, where they played a concert before the cameras and the recording devices in a simulated Concertgebouw hall. And they did a very good job at recreating the look of it on a film stage, on a sound stage. And the videos are on YouTube. They really ought to remaster it, find the negatives, find the original shellac sound recordings. It could have been an optical recording too in those days. It may have been optical, which is the sound on the side of the film, or on a shellac disc. Both of those technologies by the 1930s were around. And you can watch that, and that in many ways is the world's first concert film, albeit without an audience, because they didn't want the noise of the coughing and the clapping and the toe tapping to get in the way of the sound recording. So Wilhelm Mengelberg, a very much a pioneer in that. Now, let's fast forward a little bit and get into the actual age of videotape. And to understand the origins of videotape, we need to understand the origins of audio tape. Let's just have a drink here. Now, magnetic audio tape was invented by a company called Magnetophone in Germany in the 1930s. And after a few adjustments to the electronics in it, it ended up creating fidelity, the likes of which no one had ever heard before. Well, I have to do it in the voice when I say that. No one had ever heard anything like it. It's like nothing you've ever heard. And so the revolution was there. High fidelity was born. And by the time you get to the 1940s, not only do you have extreme high fidelity in this tape, but you also have stereophonic recording with this tape that the Germans pioneered. Now, something in the 40s, apart from magnetic tape recording, was going on. It was known as the war. Because of that, these tape recorders and playback machines that the Germans had invented were seized by the victors in the war. Some were brought back to Russia and they were reversed engineered there. Others were brought back to America by a man who would eventually found the Ampex company, the pioneer of all tape recording in America and the wider world, apart from the Soviet Union. All of this was based on what had already been in production and in existence in Germany in the 1930s. And the audio tape revolution was born. Out with low fidelity and cumbersome shellac discs, in with tape, which was easy to edit. You could record over it. Les Paul, the great guitarist, found ways to actually overdub. He invented the idea of overdubs, which revolutionized the very way that modern pop music is recorded. You can harmonize with yourself. You don't all need to be in the studio recording at the same time. You can do over a single part without touching the other. So, I don't like that guitar solo, I'm going to redo it. But the drum and the bass track and the piano track remain the same. So all of these things, apart from the great fidelity, were advantages of magnetic tape. Now, the Ampex Corporation got the idea, why don't we also use tape for video? And by the mid-1950s, that's exactly what they did. The 2-inch videotape was born. The VTR videotape recorder became a thing. And this was revolutionary for television. And there are logical reasons, but I suppose I'll lay them out. Radio, in terms of both radio and television, most of it was live in the early days. So most of the great radio shows that we hear about, they were live, certainly at least on the American East Coast. In some cases, they were live all over. And these were done by performers, whether musical performers, dramatic performers, or comedic performers, speaking in or playing into the microphones live. So think things like Orson Welles at his Mercury Theater, his Great War of the Worlds, and other productions, his Shakespeare, those were done live in radio studios by actors speaking into microphones. Same with musical programming. Um, Now, to record these, and some of them were recorded to play back for repeat. Sometimes they would be shipped to different time zones. These would be recorded mainly on shellac discs, which again, it's a cumbersome format. It's not particularly high fidelity, certainly much lower fidelity than listening to something being broadcast live. And TV was broadcast live as well. There was no medium to record television in its early days, certainly not one that was convenient. The thing that came closest, and this again, it was used to deal with the issue of time zone delays, it was something called kinescope. And it was incredibly primitive. It was a device that was essentially a film camera where the lens was fixated on a television monitor. So, remember how you used to in the 80s have the guys with camcorders filming the videos, and then they would be sold by people who have no relation at all to the mafia. Thank you very much, Jimmy Hoffa, buried under first base. That was how television was archived, and it was also how other time zones got to see shows that would be live in New York, because New York in North America was the center of the television world. Now, a lot of these kinescope archives were burned, certainly at NBC, which is why the Steve Allen shows, the very early Steve Allen Tonight shows, we don't have copies of, because they were out live, and the kinescopes that were made were burned to save space. Steve Allen has told this story many times. But by the mid 50s, you had video. And this made life so much easier, because even if you were still doing the show live, someone at a studio in LA could record it live on a videotape from New York. The quality would be preserved because it remains in an electromagnetic format, as opposed to going between the electromagnetic world of television and the mechanical world of film. Editing is easy on video compared to film, and the recording and playback is instantaneous. With film, it needs to be developed. And yeah, you can develop film quite rapidly if you have the resources, but with videotape, or with any tape medium for that matter, it's, plug and play. You press record, when you press stop, rewind, and you've got playback. And so video revolutionized television in more ways than one. Still, there were limitations, because the VTRs, the videotape recorders, were very big and bulky. So a lot of outdoor television for news, for instance, was still, particularly in Europe, shot on 16 millimeter film. But by the 70s in most of North America, and by the 80s even in Europe, video cameras became compact enough so that you could take them and do work in the field, thanks to things like U-matic, and later on Beta or Betacam, depending on if you're in a potato or whatever sort of hash brown Cracker Barrel mood you might be in. I see that we've drifted quite a ways away from our original discussion on music videos, but I swear that we will get back. So, we're in the 1960s now, groovy man. Who shot JFK? And all the other things that happened in the 60s. Videotape was the standard for television. And this meant that many music videos could be shown. Now, what were the music videos of the day? Well, even though video was around, most of them at this point, because they were shot in weird locations, they were still shot on film. Not all, but many, if not most. And they were usually used as either promotional items or used on television shows as a substitute for the band not being able to be there. So let's say that the Rolling Stones were doing a North American tour, but they had a new album that was doing really well in Belgium. Well, they're not going to leave their Spinal Tap style tour of America to go back to Belgium to film a single TV show. What they're going to do is shoot a music video and ship it to Belgium so that they can play it on Belgian TV. And this is what the Beatles became very good at in the 60s, because the Beatles gave up on playing live about halfway through their career. And instead, they shot a lot of music videos because they were on film, though. we got to be accurate. And this allowed the Beatles to be seen on television without having to break their promise not to play live. Of course, they broke that promise once at the end of the 60s with the Get Back stuff on the roof and all of that jazz. But in general, they didn't want to break their promise. Now, they were pioneers for other reasons too. These weren't concert films in the sense of the Beatles playing live, and they weren't lip syncing in the traditional sense of, oh, we're going to pretend as though we're playing live, but to the recorded studio track. These were very avant garde videos. Some have aged well, some have not. Some at the time were considered way too out there by the more buttoned up generation still listening to, Perry Como, and I did videos on that too. Not everyone was listening to the Beatles in the 60s. Herb Alpert, Frank Sinatra, Perry Como, Dean Martin, so many others, Bing Crosby, were very, very popular and at times sold a lot more than the Beatles in certain years. But the Beatles were big pioneers of this idea of let's film ourselves, walking around under a tree, painting a piano, being very 1960-ish, while all of this stuff is going on around us. And a lot of other bands caught on too. Procol Harum, one of my favorite bands, did a marvelous music video, again, on film, to accompany their song Whiter Shade of Pale. The Stones got into it. The Beach Boys did one for Good Vibrations. And these were, again, they were used because you can't be all places at once. And people were increasingly demanding to see young people music on TV. And so that's what these bands would do. And interestingly, it was something that the rock and roll artists did more than others. The Frank Sinatras, the Bobby Darin, well, he was sort of early rock and roll, but the Dean Martins, the Perry Comos, the Andy Williamses, they were still much more likely to actually go on TV and perform live. TV was very good to them, and because, as I said, they came of age in an era when you needed, as a musician, to be a fully fledged entertainer, you had to act. You had to know how to tell a joke. You had to dance if you could. Not everyone was Fred Astaire, but Bing Crosby and Frank Sinatra, they knew their way around the tap shoes. And that made that generation very, very amenable to hosting, co-hosting, and guesting on TV shows where they would perform their music live. The rock and roll guys, like I said, they didn't grow up in an age where you were expected to be an all-purpose entertainer. Brian Wilson couldn't tell a joke or act. John Lennon couldn't dance. Mick Jagger could, but could he swim? I don't know. Can he float? You get the point. And so for the rock and roll musicians of the 60s, these short music films, let's call them, were very, very important. And in the 70s, this trend continued. And in the 70s, as access to video equipment, because for all of its convenience, video was more expensive than film in the 60s and 70s. A 16, let alone an 8mm camera, was something that anyone could buy. A big Ampex or Sony VTR system was not. But as the price of video becomes more accessible in the 70s, you have a lot of bands now actually shooting music videos in both the figurative and literal sense of the word. And by literal sense, I mean they're actually shot on video. Now, one of the most important music videos of the 70s, and one that really took advantage of all of the new video editing techniques and technologies of that era, was Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody. Think of, the multiple faces in Reflection, that's a George Duke album, of Freddie Mercury harmonizing and all of the different people appearing in different places, members of the band Queen. That was all made possible through the increasingly easy reality of video editing. And that video was shown on TV shows around the world. Again, it was still a minority of bands making these music videos. Their numbers were increasing, but most bands did not feel the need to make a music film or a music video. Maybe a concert film every few years, maybe performing live on TV when invited to shows like the Midnight Special, or Don Kirshner's Rock Show, or the Old Grey Whistle Test in England, or in Germany, Music Laudien and Beat Club. But in general, the music videos, while growing in number, stay hydrated, folks, they were still a minority And then it all changed in the early 1980s when you have on this new thing called cable television a channel that was dedicated to music videos and music videos alone. And this was, of course, the MTV, music television. And this changed everything in the world of music videos. It meant that music videos were something that were entirely optional, that most bands didn't do, although, like I said, a growing number of them were. It made it so that they were pretty much mandatory. If you were releasing a single, you now needed to make a music video so that they would play it on MTV. It would be the equivalent of not giving your music video to MTV, because MTV were given the videos, they weren't buying them. That was something Frank Zappa talked about in the early 80s, and the controversial thoughts he had, or the controversy to do with MTV that he pointed out. But in any case, they were given these videos, and by the sort of second year of MTV being on air, like I said, not making a music video would be the equivalent of not giving your single to a radio station. MTV became visual radio. And so you had an explosion of music videos. Even though in the first year of MTV, as the MTV executives and VJs, that was a new term at the time, video jockey as opposed to disc jockey, as they were admitting at the time, there were in the first year, certainly in the first few months of MTV being on air, a lot of the same artists' videos were played on repeat. You might see the same Rod Stewart video to Young Turks 3 times within 6 hours because there just weren't enough music videos. That, of course, all changed rapidly, but let's actually look at a list of some of the first videos played, because I think that will give you an interesting snapshot. So, first videos played on MTV. Don't ever be fooled with thinking I prepare for this stuff. I don't. So let's look it up. So obviously the first video ever was a video that already existed, as it would have to do. And this was the Video Killed the Radio Star by the Buggles. Now, being written before MTV was a thing, a lot of people were wrong about the fact that it was about MTV. It was not. It was about the ever-growing popularity of the home video cassette recorder, or VCR, which was really starting to take off in the late 70s. So no, Video Killed the Radio Star was not about music videos. It was about the phenomenon of the video cassette recorder and this whole concept of video being the next sort of plane up from the world of audio. And so let's look at some of the other first videos that were played. You Better Run, Pat Benatar, She Won't Dance With Me, Rod Stewart. Like I said, a lot of Rod Stewart in the early MTV, because he was early money on music videos. He had already been making them, and so he was locked and loaded and ready to go. So You Better You Bet by The Who, Little Susie's on the Up, PhD. I hope you remember that one. We Don't Talk Anymore, Cliff Richard. Brass in Pocket by the Pretenders, Time Heals by Todd Rundgren, Take It on the Run, Baby by REO Speedwagon, and Rockin' the Paradise by Styx. Let's see let's look at the first 100 videos played on the MTV. And I have a feeling there's going to be lots. I mean, I know there was lots and lots of Rod Stewart. So, When Things Go Wrong, Robin Lane and the Chartbusters, don't remember them. History Never Repeats by Split Enz, a really interesting New Zealand band. Hold On Loosely, 38 Special, great Southern rock band. Just Between You and Me, April Wine, great Canadian band. Sailing, Rod Stewart. I told you we're going to see quite a lot from Rod Stewart. Iron Maiden by Iron Maiden, another REO Speedwagon, Keep On Loving You, Bluer Than Blue, Michael Johnson, Message of Love, again, a second one by the Pretenders, Mr. Briefcase, Lee Retino, probably more known for his jazz fusion work, but he was on the MTV. Double Life by The Cars, In the Air Tonight, Phil Collins. Again, that video made a lot of use of the increasingly inexpensive video editing technology. Great song by Robert Palmer, Looking for Clues. Too Late by Shoes. Stop Dragging My Heart Around, Stevie Nicks with Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. Another Rod Stewart, Do You Think I'm Sexy? Surface Tension by Rupert Hine. One Step Ahead, again, Split Ends. The bands, even though Split Ends weren't huge, they had good songs, they got played a lot on early MTV because they made more music videos than others, and it was very wise of them to do so. The video for Baker Street by Jerry Rafferty. I'm Gonna Follow You, Pat Benatar. Savannah Nights by Tom Johnston. Lucille by Roxetta. The Best of Times, another one by Styx. Again, early money on the music videos. Vengeance by Carly Simon. Another Iron Maiden. This was Rothschild. Not as in WRATH. Not as in the stuff Alex Jones talks about. I Want to Be a Lifeguard by Blotto. No idea what the hell that song is. Another Rod Stewart. I told you, Rod Stewart was the king of early MTV. Passion. Because as he said, even the Pope needs passion. Oliver's Army by Elvis Costello. You know, real downer to play at birthday parties. Don't Let Him Go. Another REO Speedwagon. Remote Control Stroke Illegal by The Silencers. Angel of the Morning by Juice Newton. Little Sister Rockpile featuring Robert Plant. Hold On to the Night by Bootcamp. Another Cliff Richard, Dreamin'. Another Lee Retinow, Is It You? Tusk by Fleetwood Mac featuring the USC Trojan Marching Band. He Can't Love You by the Michael Stanley Band. Another REO Speedwagon. I mean, Rod Stewart might have been the king of early MTV, but REO Speedwagon right up there with him. Pardon me. Rapture by Blondie. Some call it the first hip-hop crossover song. Another one by The Who, Don't Let Go the Coat. Rod Stewart is back with Ain't Love a Bitch. And the Pretenders have quite a lot too. Talk of the Town. A great one by Richie Blackmore and Rainbow, Can't Happen Here. Thank You for Being a Friend by Andrew Gold. A second airing, so because I'm reading right now the order of the first 100 videos on the MTV. You Better You Bet was played by The Who again. Bring It All Home, again by the great Jerry Rafferty. Sign of the Gypsy Queen, another from April Wine. The Man with the Child in His Eyes, Kate Bush. Message of Love, played for a second time by the Pretenders. Another great one from Richie Blackmore and Rainbow. All Night Long, David Bowie, who would end up making quite a lot of music videos. Again, he was always a master of the visual medium. Boys Keep Swinging. Rat Race by The Specials, another April Wine. Oh, no, it's Just Between You and Me airing again. Once in a Lifetime by the Talking Heads. Is this really my MTV? A Victim by Bootcamp. Another one by Rod Stewart. I cannot emphasize this enough. Rod was the king of early MTV. Tonight's the Night by Rod Stewart. A video that you probably couldn't make today. Anyway, Cruel to Be Kind. I like that song. By Nick Lowe. A Little in Love by Cliff Richard. Again, Take It on the Run by REO Speedwagon. Wild Eyed Southern Boys 38 Special. Wuthering Heights, Kate Bush. Celebrate the Bullet, The Selector. More Than I Can Say, Leo Sayer. A Message to You, Rudy by The Specials. In the Air Tonight by Phil Collins, aired again. Heart of Glass, the second Blondie that was aired. Another Rod Stewart, Oh God, I Wish I Was Home Tonight. Kid by The Pretenders. Rothschild again by Iron Maiden. Come What May, featuring Lonnie Hull and Herb Alpert. Herb Alpert was on, Pioneer in general. He was there for MTV. I Got You, another song by Split Ends. Sister Disco by The Who. Fashion, David Bowie. Again, Stop Dragging My Heart Around, Stevie Nicks and Tom Petty. Love Stakes by the Jay Giles Band. Johnny and Mary, another Robert Palmer. Again, he was early money on the music video. Tomorrow Night by Shoes, Lucille, Roxetta. Rockin' the Paradise again by Styx. Prime Time by The Tubes. I've done a video on them. More repeats. One Step Ahead by Split Ends, along with Hold On Loosely by 38 Special. Cruel You, Shoes, Little Sister, Rockpile with Robert Plant. That's a repeat by now. Calling All Girls, Hilly Michaels, Keep On Loving You by REO Speedwagon. Again, another Rod Stewart enters the chat. I Was Only Joking, and Let's Go by The Cars, along with another airing of You Better You Bet by The Who, and another airing of Time Heals by Todd Rundgren. And with that, those were the first 100 videos made on MTV. And again, the more videos that you had already made by the time MTV went on the air, the luckier you were. And Rod Stewart was definitely the champion in that regard. Like I said, in pretty short order, every artist realized that he, she, or it needed to make music videos. And in a few short years, Michael Jackson probably became the undisputed heavyweight of music videos, making them into like mini feature films and absolutely dominating MTV. And it was also unique because, along with Lionel Richie, Michael Jackson really helped to break the color barrier. Most of the bands MTV showed in its earlier days were sort of white rock and pop, but with Michael Jackson and Lionel Richie, it opened the door to more soul and R&B music. MTV, again, at first resistant to hip hop and R&B, but by the end of the 80s, Yo MTV Raps gave every real style of music a home, except for country and western, but they had their own eventually CMT. Originally, it was, I think, the Nashville Network, then it became Country Music Television, and so country had its own thing. Then you had VH1 come along, which was sort of MTV, but for people who had to wear a tie to work and had more concubines. And there you go. The rest, they say, as they say, is history. So that's my take on the history and purpose and relevance of the music video. And I said I wanted to talk mainly about the pre MTV era. I think I did, but we ended very much with the launch of MTV. Right, that was exhausting for some reason. Anyway, as always, like, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Take care.